best use of our available time. I'm Nicola Palmer. I'm a lecturer at King's College London, and I'm on the advisory board of OTJR. And it's been really fantastic to be engaged in these discussions today. It's also a real privilege to have this panel here. I think that in the first session we really touched on journalists as victims, or we raised the question around journalists as victims. In the last panel, we certainly talked about the journalist as witness. And I think what this panel reminds us of at the start is journalist as perpetrator. And if we look at Rwanda, we see journalism at a time was used very strategically to actively divide and actively foment politics along ethnic lines. And it was that particular seismic moment that actually led to the establishment of Foundation Hirondelle and the fantastic work that they've done in order to try to shift some of our ideas about how media can play a role during conflict, but also can play a role in the post-conflict society. But I think what this panel is going to remind us of is that even when it's doing that, it's in very divided societies. And so we're going to be talking about the role of the media in divided societies, facilitators or spoilers of justice and accountability. So I'm going to introduce all the panelists. We'll then they'll present for 50 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A, and then hopefully have a significant amount of time for the breakout sessions. So first I have Nicole Strem-Lau, Program in Comparative Media and Policy here at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies. Then I have Maria Ristic, who's joined us. She's the assistant editor at the Balkans Investigative Reportive Network, and Eugenio Biadoni, I hope I've got that close, who's a research fellow. He's at the Center for Socio-Legal Studies as well, and also a member of the Program for Comparative Media Law and Policy. So really continuing to bring together academic analysis and on-the-ground reporting. So let me hand first to Nicole. Thanks
Great.
so much.
Okay. Thank you, Nicola. So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the case and examples from Somalia. And it's very difficult to refer to Somalia as a whole. For instance, there's been a very strong transitional justice process in northern Somalia in the region of Somaliland. And there's been a very nascent, non-existent, essentially transitional justice process in the south, and varying degrees in between in Puntland and other regions of Somalia. Today I'm going to largely speak about the south. And I hope my comments help to also frame some thinking around the potential of the role of media in future possible transitional justice processes. So the media has always had, as Nicola said in the introduction, has always had a very central, if overlooked, role in the conflict. I think we tend to hear about the more extreme cases like Radio Mille Collines and Rwanda, but the media legacy and the role of the media in a conflict has a very strong impact on any post-conflict or peace-building process. And so by discussing some examples from what I think is one of the most destructive, long-standing conflicts on the continent, I hope that I can highlight just 3 issues for us to think about today. So the first one is around the politics of transitions and how actors that might be running media outlets and running newspapers, radio stations, etc., during struggles, think about the role of media when they come to power and during a peace-building process. And this is often not through a more normative democratization or peace-building lens. Secondly, how media reflects and participates in what is often a very highly profitable war economy. And I think we need to reorient ourselves to think about the media as an actor in this war economy and what that means. And third, a little bit of discussion, I think particularly suitable given the partners involved in this, about international efforts to shape the media. And here I think international efforts to shape the media seldom tend to focus on building on what is actually working and the logic of the media system and how things are actually functioning. I think in their zeal to encourage best practices or particular ideas of what the role of the media should be, they might obscure local practices that could serve as an effective foundation for a transition, even melding media and transitional justice processes. So the first point, looking at the role of the media in transitions. So there's been a long legacy, as many of you will probably know, there's been a long legacy of guerrilla fighters in Africa having radio stations in the bush during their conflict and during the war. I think if you look across the continent, you see many outlets, whether or not it's the government's Ministry of Information or state television or radio or private government leading newspapers. Many of those individuals, many of the leaders in these media outlets have had key roles in the conflict. And I think, for instance, you see this particularly in the transitions in the early 1990s, where media reforms across the continent after some of these insurgencies seized power, and sometimes what is called a transition of democracy in the early 1990s, many of those leaders had been active in the insurgencies. And so here, for instance, in South Africa, you can think of Zwelakhe Sisulu, who was involved with Radio Freedom during the war, and he was also involved in a lot of the ANC's newspaper and media propaganda. And he was the son of the well-known liberation leader, Walter Sisulu, but he was also the first head of the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Further north, we see in Ethiopia, for example, where Amara Aragawi, who ran the radio station for the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, was appointed head of the Ethiopian News Agency when the EPRDF came to power during the transition, and then he also launched one of the most largest well-known newspapers, The Reporter in Ethiopia. And in the case of Somalia, and specifically Somaliland, we see with the insurgency Radio Helgen, which has been instrumental in the civil war in Somalia, between Somaliland and the south. Radio Helgen directly transitioned to become the new state broadcaster, Radio Hargeisa. And the head of Radio Helgen, who's running Radio Helgen during the struggle, became the first director. And so I think you see a similar trend across the continent where appointments to leading media positions were made from these transitions of guerrilla radio stations. So Rwanda, Zambia, Uganda, Namibia, for example. And so while these transitions all happened a while ago, I think their legacy has very much continued to inform the culture and politics of radio and media on the continent. And it also reminds us of the importance of not overlooking the role of leadership, who's running these stations. And media has, in some sense, become another way for continuing the struggle, for continuing a conflict. I think South Central is a little bit different. South Central Somalia is a little bit different because the state has completely collapsed and the war is ongoing. And this leads me to the second point, which is the politics of an information-rich environment in a war economy. So media has very much been central to the conflict. You have 30 radio stations that are broadcasting in Mogadishu. You have newspapers publishing in Somaliland. Satellite television stations are beaming in from London into across the region. There's mobile money. Some of the most ambitious experiments with mobile money in the world are happening in the Somali territories. Some of the lowest mobile phone rates. So it's an extremely information-rich environment. And I think this is something that people oftentimes overlook or don't really necessarily recognize. Because there's this tendency to assume in these kinds of environments that there's nothing there. And I've heard this a lot, in Libya or in Tunisia after the state collapsed. There's nothing there, nothing functions. But this is certainly not the case. Many of the radio stations in the Somali region have been established by warlords, or they were established by warlords. And I speak generally, and I apologize, because the situation changes and shifts so rapidly that it's hard to pinpoint a particular time. So I'm trying to offer you some sort of more general assessment of the situation. So the radios have often been times established by, for instance, Al-Shabaab, which is an extremist group, has its own radio station, the African Union, the UN, the government of Somalia, other actors and fighters that are trying to consolidate power around certain territories. One of the first things they do is establish a radio station, often with funding from diaspora communities. And underlying this is a need to try and understand the logic of the system. So this isn't a completely anarchic system, but it does function according to a certain logic. And for instance, just a couple of years ago, there were more than 20 journalists killed in 1 year. New journalists keep emerging to take their place. So why is the demand for people to become journalists? Why, if there's such a high probability that you'll be killed, why are people willing to pursue this? And so in this conflict context, I think you very much also need to look at incentives. So what are the incentives for practicing journalism? It doesn't make sense to view the media as a fourth estate that's trying to pursue some idealized notions of journalism. But rather, I think the media is very much interwoven with networks of power, network of politics. And in some ways, it's like any other business in a war economy, where it profits off of the conflict. So for example, research that I've been involved with in Somalia right now has suggested a range of motivations why people are becoming radio journalists. There's certainly a significant movement from journalism to politics. And I think we see this very much in South Somalia, where Ahmed Abdi Salam, for example, the former founder and director of Horn Afrique Radio, which is a well-known radio station, moved into a series of positions in the transitional federal government, including Minister of Information, Security Minister, and eventually Deputy Prime Minister. Dahir Gel, who was head of Radio Quran, the Minister of Information, and also very active as a leadership in the Islamic Courts Union in 2006. And most recently, and I think perhaps most controversially, Yusuf Garat Omar was the head of the BBC Somali service, and he left in 2012, and a week later was running for president in Mogadishu. So the majority of journalists are not paid, but have to extract their salaries through other alternative means, through paid news, for example, where politicians might give an interview and then have it promoted as priority news on a radio station, or through Sure, where journalists might be paid to attend press conferences or even NGO development training conferences. So a whole host of organizations are often paying journalists to attend their programs. And one, just to cite a quote from one director of a private radio station that we interviewed, said, quote, "The editor of a private radio station explained how two journalists who went with him to report on a warlord ended up staying with them and joining them. Now if you see them, you would never believe they were journalists. Their culture changed. Now they cannot accept this meager income from them. I believed that what ruined them was the journalism they broke in the first place. Others have joined the warlords in the same way. They started by working with the warlord to submit his news, and after some time they became part of the militia. That's one of the reasons why they're killed. I've seen so many cases like this." And I think this leads me to my next point on the international efforts to shape the media environment for peace. I think there's a tendency for a lot of media development initiatives to be, to be donor-driven and often designed and implemented with the support of the international community. The relationship has varying impacts in very different contexts. So on one level, these donor programmings have been very important sources of income for stations. So the United Nations or the US Department of Defense, for example, or BBC Media Action might pay to have particular programs broadcast on stations. And in some cases, they're peace-building programs. In others, it might be, for instance, to counter violent extremism or to promote a new constitution, as we see is very much the case in Somalia. And at least in the case of Somalia, these efforts aren't seen as neutral, objective journalism in the way that we might think of journalism, but it's deeply rooted in the actors that are actually commissioning this work. And so the UN's involvement, for example, in Somalia, has been highly political and extremely polarizing. It's seen as interfering and favoring certain groups over others. So any effort to use the media for peace-building purposes or transitional justice initiatives, in their case, they established a radio station, Radio Barkulan, to support the African Union troops, but it has to be seen through the perspectives, through the lens of those on the ground that might be receiving this information. And so even if the UN might be framing or presenting the Constitution as a way of encouraging a transition or peace-building processes, many Somalis have been deeply critical of this, and they certainly they see the current focus of the Constitution-making process, for example, on some of these peace radio stations, as divisive and foreign. And this then leads me to my very final brief point, which is the need to have a greater emphasis on building on what is working on the ground. So looking at how the system actually functions, what is the logic of it, and how it works during the conflict, and how this would affect any kinds of peace processes that you might have. And this, I think, is counter to what a lot of the international interventions, how they approach it, where they focus on what is not working. So, for instance, the efforts by the World Bank and the United Nations right now in preparing a media law and a communications law in Somalia have been very much focused on press freedom, on freedom of expression, on international best practices. And it's very difficult to get a discussion going on how media is actually regulated, how media is actually functioning in Somalia right now. It's steer away from this sort of very much templates approach. I think think this is where actually the transitional justice community can really play a central role and really help steer this debate. Because I think transitional scholars excel at these kinds of approaches. And if you unpack the legal environment in Somalia, you can see a web of very different mechanisms for supporting the media and for regulating disputes. You see the role of Sharia courts, for example. You see the role of hair law. You also, to some degree, do see the role of formal courts in places where they do operate. So hair law, which is customary law, for example, has been involved in regulating defamation cases in Somali poetry, which is an extremely important and influential mode of communication in the Somali region. And there have been more modern efforts of trying to apply hair law and customary law to actually regulating newspapers. And I can think of one example in Somaliland where there was a case between Hatuf newspaper and the President Khan Dahir Riale's wife, where there was a major defamation case, and it wasn't resolved in the courts, but it was resolved according to hair law. So incorporating these kinds of different authorities and looking at what the role of Sharia courts might be or customary authorities might be and how they relate to legal institutions can be complicated. But I think in Somalia, or at least in the Somali territories, for example, to have an effective environment for media during transitional justice or any peace building initiatives, you're going to have to try and build and look at what's working and build on how things are actually functioning. I think it's much more likely to have a more successful process of transitional justice and the role of media in supporting these processes if you take that approach. So,
excellent. Thank you, Nicole. Fascinating and to the minute. Now to Maria Ristic.
Thank you. I'm Marija Ristic. I'm the assistant editor of Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, but I need just to briefly explain what we are doing. I'm the editor of the program which is called Balkan Transitional Justice, that is on an English web portal, Balkan Insights. Some of you may know, some of you should Google and visit. We are like specially trained journalists from 6 countries of former Yugoslavia, and we are reporting only on post-war issues. We are following war crime trials, victim rights, refugees, and in general everything that is related to reconciliation and transitional justice. I will try to do 15 minutes lecture, but I'm not promising because I'm usually just asking questions and answering them, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion. My panel will actually briefly look into the overview of the media landscape in the Balkans during the war and after. So some of you know, some of you don't, but media during the 1990s war in the former Yugoslavia played very important role. They were servants of the state, most of them, especially in Serbia and Croatia. They did a lot on promoting hatred among different groups, and they did a lot of propaganda. Some of that was included in the indictment against Slobodan Milosevic, a president of Yugoslavia, who was at the trial at the ICTY, but he died, so we actually never saw an indictment in the cases against journalists for hate speech. Serbia had several initiatives to actually prosecute journalists for hate speech during war, but to date never happened. And most of the journalists who were reporting during that period from the war actually remained on the positions in the media, now becoming editors of the programs and actually decision makers, which severely reflected on the way how media now report on these issues. So I think the level of propaganda is the same, it is just now the methods, how they're favoring one group and actually not reporting objectively when the other ethnicity is involved. We at Balkan Investigative Reporting did some research, like how media reported on several occasions, and I will give you 3 brief examples. They're all related to war crime trials. So first we followed the arrest of Mladic, Bosnian Serb commander who is now on trial for genocide and war crimes in Bosnian war before the ICTY. So we actually analyzed some articles of some 16 media outlets across the region, Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, and we actually came to the conclusion that all of the media outlets, most of them, are actually very biased when it comes to the arrest of Ratko Mladic. Bosnia, who is ethnically divided between Bosniaks and Bosnian Serbs. So the media clearly reflected the division in the society. Media from Republika Srpska were actually very cautious, didn't go into the details about the indictment and the actual what actually happened in Srebrenica. Instead, we had like several reports from Mladic's hometown, reports from the protest, but actually like in-depth reporting, why is he on trial, was actually completely left out, almost left out. In Bosnian, in part of the federation where Bosniaks are majority, actually victims felt satisfied in a way, but wanted actually more. And most of them, and the media reports reflected that, actually were commenting how they how many witnesses died, how there are many more crimes that he should be indicted for, etc. So basically reflected the feeling among Bosniak community. Croatia, because Mladic was during war active also during war in Croatia, which was briefly before the war in Bosnia. And unfortunately, for various reasons, this part didn't actually became part of the indictment against Mladic. Croatian media were actually like the main news why Mladic is not on trial for crimes in Croatia. So this was the main concern among Croatian media. In Serbia, where Mladic was hiding for years, it was actually completely like schizophrenic situation, because in Serbia you would never get like in mainstream media actual writing and actual articles about what happened during war in Srebrenica and what was the role of Serbia. This was all the time more or less like silenced. So the media were actually couldn't figure out what should they write. So they turned out to a completely TV show things reporting. Like you had weird, like even from the serious mainstream media, you had reporting what was Mladic eating for breakfast when he was in the custody, how did he look, did he get old, or whether he visited the grave of his daughter or not. Actually, no serious reporting on the indictment was present in most of the outlets. And this is basically like shows how 20 years after we still didn't move from that discourse of the war in the 1990s. This also reflects to the other case before the ICTY. Media are usually following the beginning of the trial and the end. And usually the verdicts get the most attention, and it is always completely biased reporting. And I don't know if Nerma is here, but she can back me up on this. For example, the trial of Croatian General Gotovina, who was recently acquitted by the ICTY. In Croatian media, it was presented as an example of justice and encouragement of the ICTY rule, actually how on truth. And in Serbia, this was perceived as the biggest injustice ever, that the judges were bought by different secret services, groups, powerful countries and things like that. It was all, again, conspiracy against Serbs. And actually both of media in both countries failed to actually tackle the facts from the trial. So they didn't like actually deal what was proved, what was not, but completely commenting on the outcome on the basis of the ethnicity they belong to. This, of course, also reflects on the national level when it comes, because in various countries of former Yugoslavia, we have national courts who are prosecuting for war crime trials, and for all of them, the mutual thing is there is no public interest to follow the trial at all. Media are usually only when there are big cases. They're usually at the beginning of the trial and the verdict is pronounced. So in the meantime, they're simply not interested to tackle this issue. So what we get usually is wrong reporting, like they mix facts, verdicts, indictments, because simply they're not familiar and they don't have an opportunity to like get information because they're not all the time at court. And on the other side, there is no public, because media are not following that is actually happening. I know that OSCE did a research 2 years ago, and for example, only like 5% of Serbs actually knew that there are war crime trials before Serbian courts. That is basically the situation when it comes to trials. And the other problem out of this is that victims are usually not heard. We did research last year, like in how many articles victims are mentioned, for example, for one of the big trials in Belgrade for the crimes in Kosovo, and we actually had like one media outlet running the interview with the victim. None of the media outlets ever mentioned any victim from that trial. So basically, it's either there is no interest or it is ethnically driven bias journalism, which has like various things, background in the things what happened in the 90s and who are the people who are running the media. But I think that's like the other topic, and yeah, I'm close to finishing, right?
Good, yeah. Excellent, thank you, Ria. Let me hand over to Eugenio.
Yeah. Well, I will have to start with a quick preamble, because unfortunately I wasn't here earlier for the other panel, but I was following on Twitter, and so there was a very interesting debate there. Some of the things that I'm going to say today are somehow confidential, so not the first part of the presentation. I hope I can give some sound bites and you can tweet them. But some others, when the graphs are going to pop out, I have to ask you not to tweet them. And there is also a particular reason, even if today this panel is about divided society. Just a few hours ago, the final results of the Ethiopian election, which I'm going to talk about today, came out, and the ruling party won 100% of the seat. So if you use the hashtag Ethiopia, we risk that what you're talking about now is going to get into the debate about these surprising to some, not very surprising for others results. So, but I will give you a sign that I hope to be interesting enough to get a couple of points. And and to get this stuff, usually it's Control L, but
Maybe return.
there we go. Right, and this is a project that talks. It's interesting how Nicola introduced this panel, saying that the first one was about journalists as victims, the second about witness, and this one is journalists about perpetrators. What I'm going to talk about is actually users as potential perpetrators, because when we talk about social media, of course journalists are a big part of social media, they know how to use social media, but it's the pulverized crowd that gets attention or might get attention. This is a project that talks at the intersection of media, elections, and violence. There's an increasing literature about this, and this literature, in most cases, has a shortcoming. Usually the violence comes first, and then the social science research comes next. So what the social science research has to do is sort of trace back what were the causes of the violence, what led to certain particular disruptions, in some cases evictions, in some cases killings. And there are a number of other projects, and these projects, the one I talk about today, Mechichal, actually, I didn't say that. It's an Amharic word that in a way, it mentions tolerance. It means tolerance, but it's more like fitting in. You know, I fit in a very complex society, so I respect the others, and I expect the others to respect me. And unfortunately, a bit blurry, but it's part of a series of projects that has started becoming increasingly common, and MAP have decided to, before a potentially tense event occurs, such as the elections in Kenya in 2013, in 2007, 2008, election led to systematic violence. A group of entrepreneurs started mapping debates online, trying to map trends and who was saying what, which were the groups that were the most targeted. This is a fantastic project. We are collaborating with the Umati project in Kenya, they extended to Nigeria and other places. There is one problem with projects like this one. It is they risk to criminalize online debates or to securitize online debates. In the moment you just focus on hate speech online in Kenya, and you can't really say how prevalent it is as compared to the speech in the overall Kenyan online space. You can offer some bites to journalists, to politicians, to those in power to say, well, you know, hate speech is going on and can become a justification for censoring, for putting people in jail, and so forth. And in a country like Ethiopia, where the results are of these kinds, of those of you who know the history of Ethiopia, is a country that's made many progress, but freedom of expression, human rights is not one of the spaces where Ethiopia excels in the continent. So we tried to solve this problem in two ways. The first one is through sampling. And I think this is the first project of this kind that managed to do what I'm going to tell you in a second. We had an advantage. In Ethiopia, there are a number of languages that are spoken, and are spoken just in Ethiopia. Amharic, Tigrinya, Oromefa. So it's quite easy to pick up those spaces where we know that these are spaces where Ethiopians are targeted, or Ethiopians are part of the debate. You have to do something like that in the UK. As far as I know, I don't think it's possible. Maybe some of you or some ideas. And so what we did, we managed to sample every Facebook space in Ethiopia that passed a certain threshold. So 100 followers, so is a space that has some kind of public dimension. And by doing so, and I'm going to go to the second bit. The first number, this is an old slide. The number of Facebook spaces went up to something 1,300 because we keep updating our database. So what we do is that we selectively, every day, we have a team of 8 coders, we pick up statements on a random basis so that we can say, this is actually what debate in Ethiopia about ethnicity, politics, religion, and another of some issues looks like. And then once we've done that, and we do that on an everyday basis, we can become more specific. We can target, and today, since this is a big project and I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to offer you the example of one case study. So what happens when we have a kind of a baseline, the kind of what the debate online on Ethiopia looks like, and when we can dig deeper into something that is of interest and potentially amplifies violence. The second one, Nicole sometimes makes fun of me because I think it's a bit too broad, but we'll see what she says later on. But we try to we work together, and we try to come up with a framework that builds in different tradition. But the important thing here is it doesn't focus just on hate speech. So it focuses on hate speech, but allows to map and to sort of flag different kind of conversation. So some can be leading to hate speech, and here I don't want to spend too much time on these. We call it going against and going towards. I can, delve more into it during the question and answer, during the breakout session, but this is kind of tailored in the particular political history of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a long history of guerrilla war, very rooted in Marxist-Leninism, and the idea is very much the one of the vanguard that connects with the masses and completely bypass other political elite. So there is a history of these engagements. So when we say going against, it means this history of reciprocal not just misunderstanding, but just bypassing each other. These are just unconcilable fractures that will never be solved. This is what we mean with going against. When we say going towards, it's people who actually want to move beyond the fracture and say, fine, this is the setup of the country, this is ethnic federalism, this is, we want to speak, because we're users, we're not politicians, we're people who have different types of businesses. Just to give you, I know the time is short, but just to give an example, I'm not going to go to both of them, just the first one. Something that is going against, I want to focus on human hyena, you're a thief. So there is no way that I'm trying to engage with someone. I just want to insult someone. I want to just say that people are taking away from me what I have. The second one is still an Oromo speaking with, this case is probably a Tigrayan, so someone in the highlands. The same kind of fault lines between people from the south and people of the north is articulated in a different way. We say, my Oromo friends, we know we have grievances, we know that, but some of these people have also lost their life, we're filled with us, so let's try to, and this is an example of what we mean when we say going against. This is a complicated thing, just to say, it's not that what we do is just going against and going towards. Going against opens up a kind of a semantic space where asking certain questions, is this targeting an ethnic group or a political group, a religious group, there is a call to violence, we can divide this space into from offensive speech, which is the less dangerous, to hate speech, to dangerous speech with the limited possibility of violence. A lot of, I shouldn't say that, but a lot of loaded speech is against the government. This is a government that has 6 million members, have control of the security apparatus and so forth, so it's difficult to get to action when that's the target, but in other cases it can be vulnerable groups. So in that case, we can do that. So I want to do in the, I guess, 5 or 6 minutes that I left, I want to offer an example through a case study. This is a picture of the Battle of Adwa. The Battle of Adwa was an historic moment in the history of Ethiopia, but it's the history of the continent. Is when, in 1896, the Ethiopian army defeated the Italians. So it was the only time that an African army managed to defeat a colonial army. And so it was a foundational moment in the history of Ethiopia. People who don't focus on Ethiopia per se can see these as a liberation by an African nation against the colonialists. But the people who work, I'm not going to read through this, it's just that if you can glimpse through it, just to give you an example, there are many other divides that these particular battles reflects on, and in the case of Ethiopia. And there are two, and then I will go to the data. I can sort of stop with the tweeting, I don't see a lot of thumbs, so probably it's okay. So it develops, and this was also, this is not just online, but this was also reproduced online. Two different fractures. One is between the people in the north, and Menelik, the person who won, the emperor who won Adwa, was from Shoa, was from the north, from the Abyssinian Empire, was seen like as a unified. The people from the south were actually saying, and I will show some example, well, actually this was not the war of liberation, of resistance of an African army against the colonial. These were just two forms of colonialism. Menelik was a colonialist, and Menelik colonized the south of Ethiopia. And the interesting thing here, not this that is well known, but is how it plays, is in the right-hand side, how it plays into the history of the opposition in Ethiopia. For those who don't know Ethiopia very well, especially with 100% of the votes going to the ruling party, the idea is the opposition is united, it's one against this monolith but actually even the opposition is divided along these lines. There is an opposition which is more urban, more tied to the international community, to individual rights and these kind of struggles, and there is one from the south that plays into this idea of we have been suppressed, we haven't been allowed to define our idea of the nation state. And then there is a second one, and then I move to the details, and which is Amaras versus Tigrayans. Again, for some, Menelik was a liberator. For others, it was just doing its interest and playing his own ethnic belonging against others. And the other one was between the Tigrayans, the core of the ruling coalition right now, against the Eritreans. I think the Eritreans were already dominated by the Italians. There were a number of Eritreans who were fighting with the Italians against And here I get well, I was hoping to, and I was hoping to get into the data, which I guess I'm not going to show very well. Okay, let me try to see what I can do with it. So what I was hoping to show you was that this was the subsample. So it's just around 100 statements that we picked up about Hadwa. And this was the general sample. So these are thousands of statements that are picked up about whatever that's being discussed in the case of Ethiopia. And it was showing that it's much more polarizing. There's so much more debate on Adwa and also, and this becomes more interesting, it downplays political distinction and it plays up ethnic belonging. In this country like Ethiopia, where politics and ethnicity are very tied, this is an interesting finding. So, again, this was supposed to say the same thing, and this is just to provide you some, beyond the numbers, some clear examples, and saying about these kind of fractures. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to pick up one at least, which is the one we talk about the same things, but it's the one on the right. This is saying this is one uses that goes back to this distinction between was Menelik a savior or was the colonizer, and he picks up these statements from Robert Skinner, who was a diplomat, a U.S. diplomat, who visited Ethiopia in 1903, and reported the words of a Haitian journalist, who was Benito Sylvain, who was seen as one of the funder of Pan-Africanism, where Menelik says back to Benito Sylvain's, which asked for support to the cause of liberation of the black in the United States and in France, say the Negro should be uplifted. I applaud your theory and wish you the greatest possible success, but you see, I'm not a Negro, I'm a Caucasian. And this is used in this kind of debate and saying Menelik was a racist. Menelik was not liberating Africa for Africans. Menelik was just playing his own kind of ethnic politics. And then you can imagine how these can play out in the comments, and I have to mean it. So, and this speaks for itself. This is the second type of divide. This is the Tigrayan versus the Eritrean, saying, look on the other side of the river. This is a river that divides Ethiopia and Eritrea, how the Italians were treated by the Eritreans. This is an Italian gentleman that is carried by, and again, these displays certain kinds of divides. I don't have much time to go into this, but the message that I'm trying to convey with these data that didn't show up, I was hoping to show up, is this is a project that is bigger than this case study, but it touches on the importance of providing evidence about these broad debates. So far, and I see also Nicole picked it up and others probably before, the kind of debate is about freedom of expression against censorship, securitization and security to provide development and so forth. And it's very much a divide between NGOs, international organizations, and governments that are committed to development, but have to struggle with the tensions that these development might bring and opening up of the media as well. Projects like these sort of offer empirical evidence that is needed to make these debates more nuanced and say, in the moment in which tensions appears, also counter-narratives appear. And these counter-narratives allow to say, well, the government is targeted, but the government is also engaged at the same time. There are a lot of people who are trying to speak with this government. Of course, there are people who are trying to attack it and so forth. So this is just to offer an example of the possibilities that are open up to sort of breaking this debate that is sort of has been stuck for a while and giving new energy. So, thank you.
Thanks so much.